Alexander the Great, a reputed son of Zeus himself, king of Macedonia at 18 and conqueror of the Persian Empire by 22. By the time he died 10 years later, Alexander had the largest empire of the ancient world, stretching from Greece all the way to Western India. He studied under Aristotle. He is defined even today, some 2,000 plus years later, by his pothos, his desire to always go further in his conquests. Some historians even say he reshaped the Near East, and that Christianity possibly could not have taken hold as it did were it not for him. With that kind of a resume, you'd think that the life of such a military leader would be well known, right? Wrong. The life of Alexander is widely disputed, with primary sources contradicting one another, and many based largely on bias. I wanted to delve deeper into such writings and found the book Alexander the Great by Richard Stoneman to be an excellent evaluation of Alexander literature stretching from 1997, when the book was published, back to when the Macedonian king actually lived. Stoneman reinforces early on in his book that history tends to paint conflicting portraits of Alexander depending on who wrote it. Primary sources from near Alexander's time, such as those written by Callisthenes, who went along several of Alexander's campaigns and logged them in a fantastical volume called Alexander Romance, or those of Arrian, regarded as the top historian of Alexander, or Plutarch, both of whom works ranged from 50 to 160 Common Era. All of these are often limited and contradictory to one another. Some of these primary sources claim that Alexander was a great commander and confirm that he was indeed the son of Zeus, while others argue that he was a tyrant corrupted by fortune. It hasn't been confirmed if Alexander left any official documentation of his own. The legitimacy of his will is disputed, and journals discovered are not attributable to him alone. Therefore, the overwhelming majority of sources that exist today are secondary, and even then Stoneman argues that they are affected by what is largely thought to be poor reliability of the primary sources themselves. 1877 saw the most comprehensive chronicle of Alexander's life to date, and its author, J.G. Droysen, called Alexander the Bismarck of his age and claimed the young king was responsible for uniting the world under Hellenic rule. Other authors like Wilkin and W.W. Tarn came along, and similar to Droysen's view, Tarn in particular felt that Alexander was worthy of all praise given to him. On the flip side, Ernst Badian and F. Schachermeyer both presented their own individual claims that called Alexander a ruthless tyrant, as well as extremely flawed in 1958 and 1973 respectively. A.B. Bosworth attested that Alexander was irresponsible. Peter Green presented his Alexander biography in 1974 that was drawn from what Stoneman calls unreliable sources. Stoneman goes on to suggest that the works of Robin Lane Fox and N.G.L. Hammond of 1973 and 1993 have probably gone the farthest in covering Alexander's life. Stoneman provides this thorough analysis of previous Alexander literature and does a good job of pointing this out without making his own work seem holier than thou. He does address the merit of some of the sources on Alexander the Great, present and past, but his strength lies in evaluating each for what they say about the Macedonian king, how the work was informed, and how it can portray Alexander in a different light relative to other similar pieces. So let's halt the analysis for a second and discuss Alexander's life, at least the most agreed upon version. As we've established, there are a lot of contradictions in his story, and Alexander the Great is the ancient world equivalent of either Hitler or Napoleon, depending on who you ask. Alexander was born in the summer of 356, before Common Era, son of Philip II of Macedon and Olympias. Various legends muddle the truth behind his birth. Some say he was the son of Zeus, while others claim he was the son of a pharaoh. At that time, Macedon was more of a territory rather than centered around a city-state like Athens or Sparta. By the time Alexander was born, though, Philip was making steady progress in expansion, as well as important military innovations such as the sarissa and advanced siege machinery, as well as the development of the Hypaspes, or shield-toting infantrymen. Alexander was seemingly groomed for the throne throughout his childhood. He was given Aristotle as a tutor, and Plutarch claims he was then taught specialized studies not given to average students. A persisting factor in Alexander's early life, which echoed far into his campaigns in Persia and India, seems to be his uncanny ability and tenacity. A story told by both Plutarch and Callisthenes, both primary sources, claims that his horse, Bucephalus, which remained with him through his conquests, was earned by breaking the wild steed when no one else could. As he entered adulthood, Philip was finalizing his conquest of Greece, as well as beginning to look toward Persia, and Alexander became a commander of a cavalry wing. Philip was actually assassinated soon after. Alexander soon consolidated power in Greece once he'd taken the throne by defeating the Thessalians and burning Thebes to the ground. His tenacity spread, and like waves, Athens and eventually the Hellenic League pledged loyalty, albeit half-hearted, to the Macedonian king. Alexander knew the best way to truly win them over was to move toward Persia, which he began doing in 334. The first battle of this campaign was fought near the river Granicus, and the Macedonians decidedly won. Alexander almost died here. The army then moved through and conquered several cities, all of whom pledged loyalty to the Hellenic League. Scholars disagree as to what this loyalty actually meant, though some, like Droysen and Tarn, say that Alexander created free imperial states. These historians seem to have a distinct liking for Alexander, so take that for what you will. He continued on his conquest, winning the Battle of Issus and later besieging the city of Tyre in present-day Lebanon for 6 months and using his crafty genius to construct a mole to bridge the sea gap. It remains to this day. Alexander then went to Egypt for a while, where he built his namesake city of Alexandria and was crowned a pharaoh. Always, though, his yearning, his pothos, drove him to turn back for Persia, and it wasn't long before Alexander found himself and his men amidst the defining battle of his Persian conquest, Gaugamela, in 331. In a clever flanking maneuver, Alexander managed to drill straight to Darius's camp and win the battle. Darius fled and was eventually killed by his own men. The conquering of Persia had its consequences for Alexander, though, and some historians argue that this was the turning point that eventually led to Alexander's downfall. Enamored by his own supposed divinity as well as the luxuries of the Persian kingdom, Alexander began adopting Persian customs and wearing Persian attire, which alienated his fellow Greeks. He also assured that all Persian cities could remain with their former taxes and practice the same religion. Many historians debate later if Alexander was in favor of uniting these cultures or if he was simply looking to manage his own empire. A few more examples of this will come up later. In those days, India was regarded as the eastern edge of the world, and from there Alexander figured he only had to go west in order to rule it all. The army eventually reached and defeated Sogdian Rock, and Alexander took the king's daughter, Roxanne, as his first wife. Alexander had been quarreling with himself about leaving the empire to an heir, which he didn't have at that point. At the river Jhelum in northern Pakistan, Alexander and his troops finally met the gatekeepers to their desired realm of India, Poros and his army of war elephants. At what is now known as the Battle of Hydaspes, Alexander was initially taken aback by the elephants but found a way to simultaneously flank and distract them, resulting in a Macedonian victory once more. Alexander's horse, though, the one he'd broken as a teenager and ridden into war since then, died in the battle. Despite this victory, Alexander's troops soon began to lose heart. They did not share their leader's pothos and mutinied, refusing to go any further east. Conceding, Alexander led his troops home, though on the journey he made a mistake in bringing his troops through the deserts around Gedrosa. He wished to walk in the footsteps of Queen Semiramis, who, after conquering India in the proximity of 800, returned home via this route. It proved a costly mistake for Alexander. Water was tough to find, resources in villages were scarce, and it led to the ultimate loss of some 60,000 men in 60 days. This demonstrates a bit of foolishness on Alexander's part, if you ask me, idealizing himself perhaps, taking his belief that he was a divine descent a little too seriously. Stoneman does provide a more heroic account, though, for which there doesn't appear to be any dispute, about how Alexander refused a helmet full of water from a soldier in order to set an example of endurance for the others. When the army finally made it to Iran, it became evident how the Macedonian kingdom had been slowly crumbling in his absence. Once home, Alexander took 2 more wives, one being Darius's daughter, and also arranged the mass marriage of his court officials to Persian women. This, along with his training of over 30,000 Iranian youths to join the Macedonian army, and incorporation of Persian soldiers into the phalanx, is what historians like Tarn use to argue that Alexander strove for unity of mankind. Let's not forget Tarn seems to favor Alexander in general. Others, like Ehrenberg, who typically criticized him, suggest that his actions had nothing to do with unity, but rather forcing those he'd conquered to bow to Hellenistic rule. However, according to other records, Aristotle specifically told Alexander to treat the barbarians he'd conquered as slaves to the Greeks, and Alexander's actions here were in direct defiance of such advice. What was Alexander arranging Persian marriages and assimilating Iranian youths for? Yet another example of conflicting histories. His actions were not perceived well by his army, nor were they when he dismissed over 10,000 veterans with generous severance pay. Rather than show appreciation, as Alexander expected, they showed animosity and mocked Alexander's claimed divine descent. Alexander became enraged and had 13 of them executed and sulked in his tent. Around this time, too, Antipater, Alexander's steward of the kingdom while he'd been away, is claimed to have begun plotting his overthrow. In summer of 324, Alexander's closest friend Hephaestion died of what is reputed to be alcoholic liver syndrome. Like Achilles again, Alexander mourned the death of his friend for a day and a night in solitude. It wasn't long that in Babylon, Alexander too was taken ill, and after several days of fever, he died on June 10, 323. Arrian claims that Alexander may have contracted malaria from the marshes of Tigris, and quotes his source for this, as well as events leading up to Alexander's death, as being the royal journal. The existence of such a document is widely disputed in itself. Hammond argues that no such journal existed for the period before June 324, while Wilkins said the journal was legitimate and that such journals were kept for all Macedonian kings. Bosworth then enters the mix and says the document is real, but forged by later hands. Whatever the case, Alexander's death remains one of the most controversial aspects of his life. Fingers point toward Antipater and his supposed overthrow plot, that perhaps he poisoned the king. Others say that Alexander's lavish drinking habits led to liver disease. Of course, we'll never really know, for reasons not the least of which are faulty sources. His death immediately sent tremors through the kingdom. With no heir to leave anything to, Alexander was asked on his deathbed who would be given the kingdom. He said, "To the strongest." A will was later discovered, with its legitimacy disputed as well, but historians such as Waldemar Heckel believe it to be real. Tarn believes they're fake. In any case, I'm left wondering what the world would have been like if Alexander hadn't died so young. Stoneman himself suggests that Alexander's ventures provided the matrix for Rome's empire later on, and by extension, the spread of Christianity itself. Others, like Bosworth in his 1986 article titled Alexander the Great and the Decline of Macedon, argue that Alexander merely destroyed Macedonian manpower and lived on megalomania. He claims that Alexander's goal of uniting cultures was merely so he could have more soldiers. I think that perhaps Alexander's will for unity did take hold after all. Not only did Hellenic city-states become more accepting of others, the library of his namesake city in Egypt provided a rooting point for Jewish-Greek mingling. Many successor kings of Greece revered Alexander, and stirrings following his death about his truly being the son of Zeus sprang up in Athens and Corinth especially. On the flip side that is so common of Alexander, Roman writers like Cicero and Seneca called him a tyrant, and emerging Christian works later objected to his character, rather unsurprisingly. Nonetheless, Alexander the Great was and remains to this day a symbol. It interests me that much of what is written on him is based on the historian that wrote its opinions of him. This is a natural imperative to humanity, I think. We all have bias, however subtle or otherwise, but with an ancient figure like Alexander and such a lack of historical evidence, the effects of bias are made all the more plain. If they liked him and viewed him as commendable or even as a simply effective military leader, their sources generally point toward a favorable image. If they didn't and saw him as a tyrant bent on arrogance, they explore his moral shortcomings and irresponsibility, claiming he wasn't all that he thought to be. In each case, the sources conveniently paint their desired narrative. So which can we trust? Personally, I think Alexander the Great was pretty remarkable. Sure, he sounds a bit like a trust fund kid, groomed into a crown because his competition was literally killed off, but he was able to walk the walk when the time came. If he was so irresponsible and ineffective, how come he was the first commander to take down Persia? How was he able to achieve that? How was he able to achieve the consolidation of Greece, the construction of the molded tire that remains to this day, and subsequent besieging of the city, the epic victory at Gaugamela, the conquest of Western India? How could he do it all and still be one to die young? No one had the tenacity to do it before him, and doesn't the old adage run something like, "Fortune favors the bold"? Well, Alexander died, but it favored him for a while. Military history is a million truths and lies mixed together like free atoms, all coalescing into a few theories that are generally prescribed to. It's encouraging that works like Stoneman's exist, because these types of resources encompass all, well, most at least, available viewpoints alongside one another. I found this style very helpful because it presented the information, who wrote what, and under what circumstances it may have been written. Stoneman does not give a definitive yes or no as to the truth, because again, no one knows, and I don't think we ever will, but it surely spurs the reader to be critical of what they consume regarding Alexander the Great.